Welcome back to Cinema Recaps. Today I'll be presenting a mystery horror thriller from 2016 titled The Boy. Spoiler alert ahead. Be cautious and attentive. A car drives down a road in the English countryside, with an American woman named Greta Evans asleep in the back seat. The driver wakes her up as they finally reach the house where she'll be working. He informs her that the homeowners have just stepped out and she should wait for them in the parlor. Greta enters the house, removes her shoes, and leaves them beside her belongings near the entrance. Hearing a noise from upstairs, she decides to go up. On her way, she sees a painting of a couple with their son, presumably the family she'll be working for. She goes further inside and finds a child's room. She enters, picks up a toy to inspect it more closely. The toy falls to the ground when she's startled by a man who says hello from behind. Malcolm, the delivery boy. After introducing himself, he invites her to the kitchen to show her around. There, they start putting the groceries away while chatting. Malcolm guesses she's American and thinks she's running away from someone. Wanting to change the subject, Greta asks him about the family. Malcolm tells her they're very kind and generous, but when she asks about the son, he hesitates, saying he doesn't know how to explain. Their conversation is interrupted by Mrs. Hilscher, the homeowner, entering the room and asking why Greta isn't wearing shoes. They return to the entrance to retrieve them, but the shoes are no longer where she left them. Mrs. Hilscher says they'll show up. It was just her son playing around. Greta puts on a different pair of shoes. In another room, Mr. Hilscher is speaking to his son Brahms, whose face is hidden by a chair. The two women arrive, and Mrs. Hilscher introduces Greta to her husband and son. When they step aside, Greta realizes the son sitting on the chair is actually a doll. Greta laughs, thinking they're joking, but their serious expressions tell her otherwise. Their conversation is cut short when Malcolm enters the room and interacts with the doll as if it were real. Malcolm leaves, and Greta, encouraged by his reaction, approaches the doll, shakes its hand, and says she hopes they can be friends. Mrs. Hilscher asks Mr. Hilscher to bring Greta's belongings up to her room while she shows Greta all she needs to know. When they reach Brahms's room, Mrs. Hilscher guides Greta through the daily routine. Brahms must be woken up every morning at 7 a.m. and changed into clean clothes, which Mrs. Hilscher asks Greta to demonstrate. She disapproves of Greta's method, so she ends up stepping in and doing it herself. Next, they go to the studio. Brahms has 3 hours of lessons, 5 days a week, and likes to start with poetry. Next is music appreciation, which is very important to Brahms and must be played rather loudly. A few hours later, they're all having dinner together, including the doll. When they're done, Greta takes the leftovers to the kitchen, but Mrs. Hilscher tells her not to throw food away. They're in the countryside, so they must store it in the freezer for emergencies. Mr. Hilscher enters, hands Brahms to his wife, and takes Greta outside to check on the traps. Greta follows him and sees him collecting rats from the traps in the garden. While checking, Mr. Hilscher tells her more about the house, such as the fact that all windows have been permanently shut. He says he isn't sure how they reached this point, but tells Greta that no matter how it looks from the outside, their son is still here with them. Greta says she understands. In the evening, the parents put Brahms to bed, and the three of them pray together while Greta listens. They even include her name in the prayer. Mrs. Hilscher asks Greta for a moment of privacy with her family. Greta waits outside while they talk, but the couple quickly comes out and tells her Brahms wants her as his nanny if she'll accept. Greta agrees, and Mrs. Hilscher hugs her. Greta goes to her room to call her sister Sandy on the landline phone, telling her how strange everything is, including the lack of Wi-Fi and phone signal. Sandy tells her she needed to get away, and this job fits her situation perfectly. She also reveals that Cole, Greta's ex, has been calling her house non-stop, even showing up at her house and scaring her child. But she hasn't said anything about Greta's location and promises never to tell. The next morning, Greta leaves her room when she hears some noises and finds Mrs. Hilscher scolding Brahms for throwing his toys on the floor. Mr. Hilscher startles Greta out of her observation, apologizing for the sudden rush, saying it's been such a long time since they've gone on holiday. They're eager to leave. Mr. Hilscher gives Greta a sheet of paper with rules she must follow every day. As he and Greta head toward the entrance, Mrs. Hilscher joins them, carrying Brahms. Mr. Hilscher tells Greta to be good to their boy, as then he'll be good to her in return. If she's bad to him, though, he doesn't get to finish that sentence because his wife interrupts him. Greta promises she'll treat the boy as if he were her own. After handing the doll to Greta, Mrs. Hilscher hugs her and apologizes in her ear. Greta takes Brahms outside, and together they watch the couple drive away. Back inside, Greta doesn't follow the rules. She leaves Brahms on a random chair, covers him with a blanket because he creeps her out, then heads to the kitchen to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. She takes the sandwich to a reading chair, sipping wine and reading a magazine while she eats. Eventually, she falls asleep. It's night when she wakes up. She grabs the tray, intending to take it to the kitchen, but stops when she notices the blanket has fallen off Brahms. Feeling unnerved, she picks up Brahms and takes him to his room, carelessly throwing him on a rocking chair before going to bed. Greta is woken up by the sound of a child's laughter echoing through the house. She leaves her room to investigate, and when she reaches the family painting, approaches to get a closer look at the child. Suddenly, a hand reaches out from it and grabs her neck. That's the exact moment she wakes up in bed, perfectly fine. Upset by the dream, she dresses up and goes to Brahms' room to check on him. He's sitting on the chair where she left him, with water dripping from his eye. Greta nervously comes closer, thinking it may be tears, but quickly realizes it's just water from a ceiling leak. To protect the doll, she moves him to the bed before leaving. In another part of the house, she finds a door leading to the attic and tries to open it, using a fire poker but failing. Then Greta tried to keep herself busy. She called her sister, but all she heard was the voicemail. As soon as she hangs up, the phone rings, and she quickly picks it up but hears only static. The next day, Greta is at the gate picking up the mail when Malcolm arrives with the groceries. They go to the kitchen, where Malcolm shows her they must throw all the leftover food in a trash bag that he'll take with him. Greta complains that Malcolm didn't warn her about Brahms, and he says he didn't want to ruin the surprise. Greta asks him about the story behind the doll. Malcolm takes her to a grave near the house, revealing that Brahms didn't survive a house fire on his 8th birthday. The doll showed up the next day. Malcolm says he knows it all seems very strange, but it's harmless. Greta does the math and realizes the couple has been living like this for 20 years. Malcolm tells her they had been looking for a nanny for a year before Greta came along, and if she's feeling restless, he can take her out to show her the town's nightlife, promising not to tell anyone. Greta agrees, after making sure Malcolm understands this isn't a date since she recently got out of a relationship. In Brahms' room, we learn all conversations in the house reach Brahms through the walls. Greta is in her room, on the phone with Sandy, telling her about her plans for the night, but can't convince her sister that this isn't a date. Sandy approves. Greta needs to get out more. When glancing at the mirror, Greta notices Brahms looking at her from the other room. Feeling creeped out again, she closes the door. Later, she goes to the bathroom to take a shower, unaware of another presence in the room. Someone has taken her dress and necklace. When she comes out and looks at herself in the mirror, she notices a chunk of her hair is missing. Then she realizes her belongings are also gone. Returning to her bedroom, she finds all the drawers open and all her clothes missing as well. Frightened, she leaves her room, only to find the attic door open with the stairs down, ready to climb. Thinking there might be an intruder, she grabs the fire poker and goes up to the attic. As soon as she enters, the door closes behind her, and she's unable to open it again. When she hears a car, she goes to the window and sees Malcolm knocking on the door. She tries to make a noise to get his attention, but he can't hear her. Next, she tries to break the window with the poker, but only manages to break the poker itself, and Malcolm leaves. A human-like shadow startles her, and she falls to the floor, hitting her head and losing consciousness. She wakes up the next morning, still in the attic, realizing the shadow she saw was just clothes on a hanger. She finds a photo album from Brahms' childhood among some old things. Flipping through the pictures, she comes across a family painting and the original photo it was based on, where Brahms looks much more serious. Greta's thoughts are interrupted as the attic door suddenly opens on its own. She leaves and goes to her room, only to find her clothes back, hanging all over the furniture. Malcolm visits a few hours later, and together they check the house for any signs of intruders, but find none. Greta points out that this still doesn't explain her clothes moving around on their own. To help her feel at ease, Malcolm decides to stay with her for a while. While playing pool, Greta asks Malcolm to tell her more about the real Brahms. He initially hesitates, but after her insistence, he reveals the story he knows. There are 2 different stories about Brahms around town, he says, and the truth lies somewhere in between. The polite version describes Brahms as a good kid, but the talk at the pub paints him as rather strange. When Greta asks for the truth, Malcolm tells her about the time he came to the house to make a delivery for Brahms' birthday. Mrs. Hilscher was opening presents with a doll, while Mr. Hilscher was in the pool room, drinking and mumbling about not being able to take it anymore. Malcolm shares that Mr. Hilscher invited him to drink, and when Malcolm asked about the real Brahms, The father replied with a broken look, saying the boy was odd. After checking to see if Greta really was all right, Malcolm leaves. Greta returns to her room to call her sister Sandy. Sandy informs her that Cole has been by her house again, and Sandy's kid, trying to get rid of him, gave Cole Greta's address. Sandy apologizes, but Greta assures her it's okay. After hanging up, Greta goes to the bathroom to brush her teeth, where she notices a moving shadow in the mirror. She heads to Brahm's bedroom, where she finds sheets of paper scattered on the floor. She adjusts the doll's position, but its head turns back on its own, looking straight at her. At that moment, Greta wakes up in her bed, again hearing noises from outside. When she opens her door, her lost shoes are waiting outside. Terrified, she heads to Brahm's room, where she finds the doll sitting on the bed's edge with a list of rules beside him. Greta runs back to her room, locks the door, and tries to make a call, but the phone doesn't work. After hanging up, the phone rings immediately, and when she picks it up, a child's voice calls her by name, asking why she isn't following the rules. Greta drops the phone, but then there's a knock on the door, and something is left outside. It's your favorite, the voice says. Opening the door, Greta finds a tray with a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and Brahms is still sitting on the bed with a list of rules. Greta approaches the doll and finally realizes that Brahms only wants her to follow the rules. Malcolm calls to invite her out, but Greta hangs up, her full attention on the doll. Elsewhere, the Hillshires write a farewell letter to Brahms, fill their pockets with rocks, and walk into the ocean. The next day, Greta starts following the rules precisely, except for the goodnight kiss. Days later, Malcolm visits since she hasn't answered his calls, bringing her mail, which she ignores. After promising she's fine, he tries inviting her out again, but she declines, and he leaves. Greta tries to communicate with the doll by asking it to fetch a fruit and wondering if it is present. At first, there's no response, but as she leaves the room, she hears a noise, realizing Brahms has moved on his own. Later, Malcolm returns because Greta called him, needing someone else to see it. After repeated testing, Greta discovers that Brahms only moves when nobody is watching. To prove it, she draws a chalk outline around him on the floor. Then Greta leaves the room with Malcolm. After a few minutes, they came back to check and saw nothing had changed, but Greta wanted to try again. She gently asked Brahms to help her this time. When they return after a few minutes, they find the doll is no longer standing in the chalk circle. Malcolm finally believes her. Later, they sit and talk, and Greta reveals that she believes everything happening is for a reason. She shares that her abusive ex caused her to lose her pregnancy, and Malcolm now understands why this is so important to her. They share a kiss. That night, after putting Brahms to bed, Greta returns to her room, where she and Malcolm begin to kiss. Someone watches them through the keyhole, and the sudden sound of music interrupts them. They go downstairs to find the record player on, and Brahms sitting nearby. Greta takes the doll back to bed before going to the kitchen to make coffee. Malcolm advises her to spend the night in town, but she refuses. In response, he tells her another story. Years ago, a little girl named Emily Cribbs used to come over to play with Brahms. One day, her body was found not far from the house. On the same day, it caught on fire, and the killer was never found. Greta still refuses to leave. She goes to Brahms's room and, for the first time, gives him the goodnight kiss. Afterward, she goes to the attic and looks through the photo album again, finding pictures of Emily, noticing her uneasy expression as Brahms stared at her in a creepy way. The next day, after returning from checking the traps, Greta hears the sound of the pool table. She goes there with Brahms and finds that Cole has broken into the house. They have dinner together, and Cole tries to convince Greta that he's changed and wants her to come back with him. Malcolm shows up, and after some awkward introductions, he uses the groceries as an excuse to talk to Greta privately. He tells her he's worried Cole might hurt her, but Greta reassures him, saying she has a plan. Malcolm leaves the house but stays close, waiting in the car just in case. Inside, Greta brings Cole some sheets and pillows to sleep on the couch. Cole tries to convince her again to leave with him and attempts to kiss her, but she dodges. Before leaving, she takes Brahms to his room and tells him she needs his help. Later that night, Cole is woken up by water dripping on his face. He finds rats in his bag, a message in red on the wall saying, "Get out," and the doll sitting nearby. Greta runs to him when she hears him shouting her name, and when she arrives, he accuses her of setting up everything. Cole grabs Brahms, and in anger, he starts chasing her around. Malcolm hears the commotion and rushes inside to see Cole snatching the doll from Greta. Cole shakes the doll violently. Ignoring Greta and Malcolm's pleas to be careful with Brahms, in a rage, Cole smashes the doll against a chair, breaking it to pieces. Suddenly, strange noises echo from within the walls, and Cole approaches a mirror, trying to trace the sound. The mirror shatters, throwing Cole backward and revealing a man wearing a porcelain mask, the real Brahms. Calling out for Greta in the same childlike voice she heard on the phone, Brahms lunges at Cole, and after a struggle, he manages to kill him. He then grabs Greta, but Malcolm appears from behind and hits Brahms, giving them a chance to escape. Brahms chases them through the house, and although Greta and Malcolm try locking themselves in her room, Brahms knows the secret passages in the walls and has no trouble reaching them. After a tense chase, they find an opportunity to escape when they discover a door leading into one of Brahms's hidden wall passages. Inside, Greta and Malcolm find a secret room where Brahms has been living all this time. Greta discovers her dress and hair on a doll that Brahms created to imitate her. She also finds a letter from his parents, telling him they wouldn't be returning and that he could have the girl. They exit through the hidden passages, but Brahms quickly catches up with them. He lunges at Malcolm, knocking him out as Greta finds an exit and runs away from the house. She reaches the gates but stops, realizing she can't leave Malcolm behind. Determined, she heads back to the house, grabbing a screwdriver she hides in her pocket before facing Brahms again. She tells him she's returned for him, using her firm nanny voice to order him to go to bed. After a moment's hesitation, Brahms obeys, letting her take him to his room and put him to bed. When she tries to leave, Brahms asks her for a goodnight kiss. She refuses, saying it's his punishment for misbehaving, but he grabs her arm and insists. Left with no choice, she leans in for a kiss, and when his porcelain mouth touches her real lips, she pulls out the screwdriver and stabs him. Brahms pushes her away, stands up, and grabs her by the neck, pinning her against the wall in an attempt to strangle her. For a moment, Greta seems to lose consciousness, but at the last second, she fights back, pushing the screwdriver deeper until Brahms collapses. A piece of the mask breaks, revealing part of Brahms's real face. Greta rushes out of the room, finds Malcolm, and gets him into the car so they can escape the house. She smiles, relieved they're finally free. The movie ends with a pair of hands wearing sleeves similar to Brahms's carefully gluing the doll back together. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can watch more videos like this. Thanks for watching.